Welcome to the Gender in Focus podcast. I'm Elle, and each week I get to ask Kai Scott, the president of Transfocus Consulting, all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about trans and non-binary people in the workplace and in the wider world.
We've been into so many different workplaces and companies, and you can really tell right away, where things are at, right? And what kinds of values are promoted, and what they've already done to kind of create the environment.
In terms of my own coming out as non-binary and how nervous I was beforehand, I obviously worked for Transfocus, and I could guarantee that it would be accepted. So I can really only imagine what that must be like if you weren't 100% sure of the reception that you would get.
In today's episode, we're talking about inclusive culture and what it takes to support trans and non-binary employees in the workplace. That means having disclosure guidelines in place before anyone comes out, or creating inclusive environments, even if you don't know that there's a trans coworker in your presence, and balancing culture with structural changes as well, and making sure they're woven together. Culture is easy to notice, and structure like policies and practices make it stick. And inclusion isn't a one-time switch, it's a community of practice built on constant reinforcement and dialogue. And I'm really excited to talk about this and unpack it further with my colleague, Elle. Elle, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Kai. How are you doing? It's September. You're feeling fresh, ready to go.
That's right. And with distant memories of backpacking in the Alpine.
Right.
But yes, I'm here for it. I'm ready to shift gears.
Good. I'm glad. Well, I suppose I should start with the obvious question, which is what do we mean by inclusive culture, Kai? Because that feels very broad.
Yes, indeed. And we're all striving for it, and sometimes it's hard to kind of pin it down. There's many different features of inclusive culture, and this is, in more broad equity, diversity, and inclusion conversations. But I'll try to make it specific to gender diversity, in that it is a culture that is welcoming of all or any genders across the gender spectrum. There's an understanding and appreciation, even celebration of folks and their various unique gifts and what they contribute, and kind of, not necessarily calling upon them, but open to them and inviting of them to be a part of the workplace. There are practical considerations when, interacting with somebody, especially if we don't know that person. So wanting to have, a kind of attuned to and understanding, to be open to, what that person's pronouns are or what their gender is, and even being responsive to somebody sharing updates about who they are as well, and being aware of the issues, so that if things come up, whether it's a joke or an appropriate comment, that people can step in and intervene. So these are some of the features of that culture, but there's kind of an openness, a curiosity, a desire to work together to understand one another, even if maybe that doesn't understanding isn't there right away, that kind of committed to continuing to dialogue, to be able to reach that understanding, and to be supportive of folks, especially if there are moments where either somebody's not there to defend themselves, or is just too tired to step up. And so those are some of the aspects of an inclusive culture.
So it's sort of looking like Uber allyship then. It's like a sort of a community
Indeed.
allyship.
I mean, it doesn't always have to be action oriented, right? I mean, of course, we're inclined towards action, especially in the West, but there is like an essence of it as well, where people can just be themselves, and don't have to do a lot of effort to make space for themselves, or it's just like this kind of get to be, rather than have to push for or defend or correct, and all of that.
So obviously what you've just painted out is the ideal scenario. That's what
Hmm.
everybody's hoping that they can create at work, or at least people who are interested in this work. So where do we begin when it comes to starting that and kind of creating that culture? um, there's sort of two areas that I want to look at, which would be first the role of the individual, and then also the role of management.
Mm.
Is sort of hang on, wait, they're both individuals, but do you know what I mean?
Yes, like a frontline worker versus
That's it.
people in leadership.
Right. Guess who does not have corporate experience? Uh, yes, that's what I want to talk about. So I guess maybe we should look at first the role of sort of frontline workers and what that can look like. And we have already got a couple of episodes on allyship, which I'll link in the
Mm.
show notes. But yeah, could you go into that a bit with regards to inclusive cultures?
Yeah, frontline workers are a big deal in my mind, at least.
Hmm.
They're an essential part of creating culture, and oftentimes are either overlooked or underappreciated with that regard, right? Because it's oftentimes, especially in certain industries, they're the ones interacting with clients and the public, or
Hmm.
whoever kind of outside of the organization, and provide an important indication of the health of the culture, and whether it's kind of in this positive vein, living up to the values of the organization and bringing you know good products or services to folks, and or are suffering if the culture isn't set up really well for them to
Hmm.
thrive, and then often having to handle a lot of issues that really aren't theirs, but just because of how things are set up, they're not supported to do their best with folks. And so they are often, because they're interacting so much with folks outside and also within, they can really exhibit that inclusive culture. Um, Oftentimes in interactions, there's usually a lot of interacting, and so that, especially if you don't know somebody, if it's a client that you're meeting for the first time or a member of the public, that's where those are the opportunities to practice gender inclusive language, as an example, where we're not
Hmm.
jumping automatically to a conclusion of who that person is and what types of terms to apply to them. It's more of an open stance to be ready to listen what that person is saying about themselves, or just using gender neutral terms as a placeholder until more is known, right?
Hmm.
When it comes to coworker to coworker, on frontline level, it's more about respect and understanding and working together to create something. um, there's some benefits to productivity as well when people work together well, and also we spend so much time at work too, right? You want it to be a
Right.
pleasant experience, and so that's where that collaboration is really key. And part of that is getting to know one another, and
Hmm.
gender is a part of that, among so many other factors. It's not the only one, but then just being able to have those conversations in a respectful and considerate manner, right? Not asking too many questions, but not none, because
Right.
because that also might not send the right message. So it's just this kind of um, process of getting to know one another and working together in a productive way.
Hmm. So, in comparison, then to that, we've got the role of managers, and you've mentioned a couple of times on the pod
Mm.
that managers are often really trying and really want to do the right thing,
Mm.
but it is so hard to know what to do,
Yeah.
and not sure about what their role is, or
Mhm.
um, what is for them to handle and what is for people to handle amongst themselves. And
Yeah.
so, I'll link those episodes in the show notes too. But I was wondering if you could dive into that in terms of, yeah, supporting this culture of
Mhm.
inclusion.
Yeah. Well, managers and leaders in general are super important. And I think most of them know that or recognize it,
Hmm.
is that they set the tone at the top. And often, if they're not kind of modeling particular behavior or ways of being, or, the appropriate approach, then, frontline workers, often make up their own thing, or figure
Hmm.
out their own way of doing things, and
Right.
might not be quite what is right, or is what is called for in the moment. And so that's where leadership, understanding on this topic of gender diversity, but so many other topics, is super crucial. I do have a heart for managers as well. There's a lot to know and to
Hmm.
consider, and it's a very dynamic space, along with just all the things that need to be done, right?
Hmm.
As part of the
Right.
work. But there's this added layer. But certainly, if their understanding of the values, under the direction of the company, and are sharing that with their teams or their reports. And that's really crucial when it comes to knowing trans and non-binary folks. Even if there's not somebody on the team, it is important. I always just assume there's somebody. And
Hmm.
that's a helpful way for folks to then start to practice. And it's either, it could be a preemptive way of bringing up these topics in small little bite sizes, to show that these are important topics. Trans Day of
Hmm.
Remembrance is coming up in November, right? So there's these opportunities to, if it's on an annual basis or an article that somebody's read, to show that. Of course, if somebody is on the team who is trans and non-binary, it's even more important for leaders to be looking out for issues, and even to surface them with broad questions like, how are you doing at work, to the trans or non-binary person. um, or if that person is just coming out, there's specific roles for managers in that process. And so, yeah, it's really important. Oftentimes, especially in court cases that we read, managers are often failing trans and non binary folks, not through malice mostly. It's just
Hmm.
that they don't recognize that in some instances there's discrimination happening, and that it's
Hmm.
not just a difference of opinion between two people, a trans person and a cis person, or a non trans person. It's actually a really awful thing happening, and that the manager
Hmm.
needs to step in and work with the trans or non-binary person and the other person to resolve the issue. Otherwise, it kind of escalates from there. So there's a lot of dynamics that, and issues that managers can come across, whether or not they know somebody is trans on their teams.
Hmm. I actually was going to ask you a question about that, and you jumped ahead and brought it up anyway, which was the idea that we don't have anyone who's trans on our team.
Yes.
And so creating these cultures, or this culture of inclusion, and especially having the conversations about trans and non-binary people, sometimes people will look at that and think it's not relevant to their
Yeah.
team because there aren't any trans people in that. So I was wondering if you could go into that a bit more, because of course that's not
Mm-hmm.
true, and there probably is someone who's trans, or there
Yeah.
will be.
It could be. There are folks, trans and non-binary folks, who choose not to share that they are trans or non-binary. This, I
Right.
think, is a little bit more on the trans men and women side of things, right? If they come out and perhaps if they need it, undergo some sort of medical or social transition, then they're done. They don't want to
Hmm.
share it with other folks. So people could have somebody that they perceive as just a man or a woman, without kind of knowing that history, on their teams, and they
Hmm.
don't need to share that. It's not a necessary piece of information, although if somebody shares, that's great too, right? But just honoring that. So, with that in mind, there's also another factor that is actually probably a little bit more common, is that you actually have a cisgender person who has a trans or non-binary loved one, right? It
Hmm.
could be a child, it could be a partner, it could be, whatnot, right? And so just realizing how you talk about trans or non-binary issues, or whether you talk about it, speaks volumes to any number of these people. And another category of things I want to mention is somebody just before coming out. And that's actually the most critical, because they're actively looking for signs of safety. And I would say the others too, but this is a more practical matter for the person just coming out. And so
Hmm.
you really want to be You know, not constantly, obviously, but just like like every day. Have you thought about this? What about this? You know, just these moments of an opportunities, whether it's something in reaction to something or whether it's a proactive thing, can really help people understand that it's a safe place, that this is a manager or leader that's going to have my back, whether it's I'm about to come out or I, you know, have a loved one that I'm worried about. Um, and also helps educate cisgender folks who many people don't even have the basics on gender
Hmm.
diversity and are really just looking for opportunities and finding none, and are often not in a place of doing their own research. So this is where managers and leaders can provide some of that heavy lift. It's not even that
Hmm.
heavy, but it is a lift that really
Hmm.
speaks volumes.
I always think about this when, in terms of my own coming out as non-binary, and
Mm.
how nervous I was beforehand. I obviously worked for Transfocus, and I would guarantee that I was going to be accepted and that it was an inclusive environment. I already knew that about Transfocus, and even then, I was still super nervous to
Mm.
tell you. I don't know why I was so nervous, but I was really
Yeah.
nervous, um, and that's when I could guarantee that it would be accepted. So I can really only imagine
Mm.
what that must be like if you weren't 100% sure of the reception that you would
Yeah.
get, if you haven't already set up this culture of inclusion, and where these topics of conversation are not constant, because that would also feel like a bit of a spotlight. I think I'd be a bit overwhelmed if it was a constant conversation, but if
Yeah.
it is a conversation,
Mhm.
um, it would make that jump a little less steep, I think.
Mm. Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
that's always how I imagine it. Or I felt like a flailing fledgling, like jumping off of a tree. And
Mm.
that was with Transfocus. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's such a good point that, you know, it's about, you know, these moments that people are thinking about that are weighing heavily on their hearts. And then, you know, if you're able to hear a positive message, even if it's brief, that can help, you know, make that cliff a little smaller.
Hmm.
It's still going to be a cliff because it's a big
Yes.
moment. There's a vulnerability to it. It's something that a lot of our culture has no framework for, right?
Hmm.
Like there's no pathway, no rites of passage, you know, just like nothing.
Hmm.
And so it really is a big deal when people share that. So yeah, and to prepare for that, any little signs can be really powerful.
Hmm. And the fact that it was sort of bubbling under the surface. Well, I started Transfocus a few months prior
Mm.
to coming out, or I think it was 6 months prior. And so for 6 months, I was thinking, like, should I, should I, should I? And
Wow.
that was even, again, in such a safe environment. So
Mhm.
yeah, not knowing if somebody's trans doesn't guarantee that there isn't anybody that's trans
Yeah.
on your team, or trans and non-binary. I wanted to ask you about how this isn't just about trans and non-binary people and issues
Mhm.
related to that, but it's also about kind of wider culture, and how, just if you haven't sorted out the wider culture, dropping in education about trans and non-binary people, it isn't going to work. It's not
No.
going to make your culture inclusive. So yeah, I
Mm.
wanted to get your perspective on that, and
Yeah.
if you have any examples of that. I don't know if you do, but
Oh yeah. My goodness, it's so true. Because we've been into so many different workplaces and companies, and you can really tell right away,
mm,
you know, where things are at, right? And what kinds of values are promoted, and you know, what they've already done to kind of create the environment, and or not, right? And it's just kind
mhm,
of happening willy-nilly. And if we are coming into, I always like when we're coming into a place that is either already has an EDI framework or done some sort of other EDI work, or you know, even just has a strong set of values that they reiterate everywhere, right? That there's
mm,
constantly reflecting on and thinking about, and itemizing too. It's not just like a general feel good vibes
right.
sesh, but like actually like this is how I actioned the values,
Hmm.
you know. And especially I look at the values, you know, of inclusion or care, consideration, even respect, like just anything to signal that some social aspect has been thought of, right?
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference. if you have a workplace culture, maybe not directly created this way, but that is super competitive, and then you bring in this type of session where we're asking folks to consider and understand and perhaps adapt some of their behaviors, that's not going to work too well. And it
Right.
might even accentuate that competitiveness and make it weirder, rather than like a collaborative one. A collaborative culture would be really easy to insert what we're sharing in education sessions or even creating a structural change.
Mm,
People are like gung ho to like figure it out and they're solutions oriented. Like, okay, yeah, let's do this. So
hmm.
yeah, it just, if you haven't worked on your broader culture, it's going to be really difficult. Or it's still possible. Just it's kind of cart before the horse, and
Right.
that can make it really difficult to implement this. Still
Mm.
possible, but going to be doing extra lifting to reinforce and to reiterate and make sure it sticks.
With regards to preparing your workplace for trans inclusion, even when you don't know if
Mm,
somebody is trans or not, one of the topics that you mentioned at the beginning was also transition guidelines. And
mm,
so I wanted to ask about that because we've also mentioned them in other episodes, especially recruitment and having that available for
right.
people who are looking to be hired. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's sort of a good indicator of how inclusive your culture is. So yeah, I
Yeah.
was wondering if you could go into that.
Yeah. I mean, those guidelines are really important. It's a bit of legwork that an
Mhm.
organization undertakes before, or even if you have trans and non-binary folks, just to kind of sort out the details of what does support actually look like. And this is
Mm.
welcomed not just by trans and non-binary folks, but actually by cisgender folks, particularly managers who are like, oh, thank goodness, just need some
Right.
detail, anything,
Yeah.
just um, what do I do? How do I support folks? And just spelling it out in what has been typically called a transition guideline, but we're starting to call them more like just how to support trans and non-binary folks in the workplace,
Mhm.
toolkits, guidelines, whatever you want to call them, and essentially just kind of mapping out what trans and non-binary folks can ask for, what cis people can do to be more supportive.
Mhm.
Some of the day-to-day pieces that maybe people wonder about but are not sure, and so are silent. And so instead of silence, they could be like, okay, now I know the nuances of, is it
Mm.
appropriate to ask questions? If so, what
Right.
kind of questions? Just really spelling it out. It might seem simple, but it actually is really helpful. And having that set of guidelines or a toolkit available on the intranet, even publicly,
Mhm.
that you can search for on somebody's website so that you can show that you've done this work, because it is a bit of work because you have to kind of think through all the details, especially in the coming out process. There's a bit of insight that presents to how ready are your systems for
Right.
an employee, right?
Yeah.
So it's a readiness check. And there's some bit of uh, kind of aha moments that come from it, like, oh, okay, our systems aren't ready, and how do we
Mhm.
fix that, right? So may take some time depending on what kind of systems or processes. And but having that for somebody who is applying to your company or is even within the company and maybe not going to come out or already out, that signals a lot about
Mhm.
how important this topic is, that it's you know we're going to spend some time on it to do it right, and provide some education, like just
Right.
really do it well. And it helps people understand that this is a workplace that values them. Of course,
Mhm.
not the only thing, but it's a big one because it's an effort to create something like that.
You mentioned just then about making sure that the systems are ready and having all of these other thoughts and things that maybe hadn't been considered. And that kind of leaks into the more structural side of things.
Mm,
And so I wanted to get you to talk about the relationship between the structural challenges and the cultural challenges and how you can't really have one without the other.
mm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a big framing that we use at Transfocus is we do distinguish between cultural and structural. So, how we interact with one another, team dynamics, the culture more broadly, all of that is kind of under the
Hmm.
cultural banner or bucket. And then the structural side is, systems. Do you
Hmm.
have two field names? Are you collecting gender? Even washroom design within an office space. All of these are kind of the structural aspects that, I mean, of course, they need to operate together. So if you just have the cultural, people are amazing at interacting with trans and non-binary folks. That's awesome. And then somebody pivots to a form and there's only two gender categories on it. The
Right.
cultural stuff just kind of falls apart, sadly,
Hmm.
right? Because that
Hmm.
is a very important thing. It's not dismissing it in any regard, but it's
Hmm.
just like, oh, but wait a second, these are at odds. I can't reconcile this amazing treatment with this crappy form, you know? And so uh,
Right.
that's where it's really critical to consider both, right? And oftentimes companies are very focused on the cultural, which they should be, because humans, we're very social creatures and, we want to gel. And so that you want to square that away, but not to ignore or not look at the structural side of things where
Hmm.
checking all of these different places where gender is sometimes kind of hidden away and can be a barrier for trans and non-binary folks, and uh, addressing those uh, also requires a bit of a cultural aspect to it, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Education, answering questions, revising scripts, even the way we might navigate things might change too, right?
Hmm.
If a washroom, is perhaps converted to another type to make it more available to any gender, that might be a bit of a cultural shift to be
Hmm.
like, okay, right,
Yeah.
this is no longer a men's or a women's washroom. This is a single unit washroom or whatever, right?
Hmm.
Or maybe even multi-stall, right? And
Right.
so that kind of shift in thinking and might need to be a part of the mix. It's not because sometimes what people, companies do is they just change a structural thing and then don't tell people about it,
Right.
and they're like, "What?" And then sometimes they're upset, right? And so
Right.
if you add the cultural aspect, involve them, educate on it, help them understand that the values are still intact, that can be really helpful.
So on that kind of education and reinforcing the things that you're wanting to implement within this sort of workplace culture,
Mhm.
you've talked to me before about creating this community of practice, and I was wondering
Mm,
if you could explain that a bit further.
yeah, this is so important. We've observed that the education sessions that we deliver are really important, kind of foundational basis. However, they're usually pretty theoretical in some sense
Hmm.
because it's like, oh, okay, I understand logically what you're saying, but then kind of the devil's in the details in terms of how you do that. And so
Hmm.
we found that kind of as a next step past, say, the basics or even intermediate level or some of the manager specific training that we have is a small group of practice to set aside some time and work through either role play or, you know, talking about a scenario that somebody has experienced and just unpacking that a bit and going into some of the nuances and maybe redoing some of that interaction to be able to have a different outcome, especially if maybe it wasn't the best thing that happened.
Mm. Right.
Also, opportunity to practice somebody coming out at work. If we don't have an opportunity, sometimes we can be a bit deer in the headlights just because it's new, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Just like, whoa. Versus actually my brain and my mouth have worked together to come up with words that are authentic to me, that are my style, but also encouraging and supportive and whatnot, and maybe doing a few iterations of that. Another thing is the singular use of they them is new to some or many actually, and not a lot of opportunity to practice that. So just, using they them for either an actual colleague or for someone fictitious, and just working through some of that kind of clunkiness that comes at first, but then smoothing it out. So there's so many things that in this kind of small group, judgment free, just, really there to lean into what one has learned and make it come to life, I think is really key.
When you've done those in workplaces,
Mm.
how has the response been when you've done, what are they called? Practice pods? Is that right?
Practice pods,
Sorry, my
yes,
mind
yes.
went blank. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I do work here. Yeah, what are the responses that you've had when you've been doing those practice pods?
Absolute relief. I think
Oh,
people just
really?
they're just so worried, and they get this new knowledge, they're excited by it, but then also
Mm,
super intimidated. And so this opportunity, especially the judgment free aspect where it's a
mm,
small group, so you're not this kind of limited exposure to,
right.
bunch of different people, um, and that everybody's there to do the same thing and recognizes that we're not going to get it 100%, and that's okay. That's part of the process. And of course, encouraging facilitation by myself and others, and that can really help bring down some of the high anxiety level,
Mm,
especially on something that has sadly become quite political, and
hmm.
people are further distancing themselves because it's just like this feels like a lot and too much, versus
Right.
if you actually practice, it actually becomes way simpler and depoliticized, and it's just like, oh, this is another feature of life, right?
Hmm.
And I like that because it is way simpler, but just needs some practice. I'm the same way. I'm getting back in the swing of German. I grew up in Germany, and but then didn't speak a lot of German for a good chunk of time, and now I'm back to learning it. It's awkward at first, right?
Hmm.
And it's embarrassing even a little bit, right? Because I want to
Right.
be. I remember when I was so much further along, and so it's just, yeah, I mean, just letting go of that self consciousness and being like, this is a part of it. It's uncomfortable, but leaning into it, and showing up and doing this practice will make it easier, and it has for me. And it, on other topics like land acknowledgements, I was similar, 20 or so years
Me
ago.
too. Oh,
Blah.
me too, about 3 months ago. But yes, it's awkward at first, but with
Yeah.
practice, it becomes kind of second nature, I guess.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I will put a link in the show notes to the practice pods and all the other stuff that we have. And is there anything else that you wanted to bring up before we go?
No. Well, actually, yes. I would just say that culture is super, super important. I don't think anybody listening to this would hopefully disagree with that
Hmm.
statement. It's not super
Right.
controversial. But that the I would say that trans and non-binary folks are particularly attuned to culture and are very observant of what's happening, dynamics and issues, and how things are handled, and transparency and accountability, and just and absorbing all of this to determine how they fit within that, and how much are they going to share, or how much or little they're going to share of themselves. And
Hmm.
so there is value, obviously not just for trans and non-binary folks, but since we're talking about that specifically, to really work on that culture, so that there's hopefully trans and non-binary folks are reading a degree of safety, and even, dare we say, belonging that they could have there, and really be excited about being a part of the organization. So I definitely invite folks to invest in that development of culture.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Kai.
Thank you as well. It was good to talk this through, and hopefully provide some insights for folks. And yeah, thank you.
Sweet. Well, see you next week.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Bye for now.
Bye.